absolute values. But for some people, that's talking about ghosts. Absolute values? You must be joking. Everybody knows that everything's relative, nothing's absolute. It's all pick and choose as you go. But still, I think it's worth discussing. Might even give rise to some surprises. I would like to organize the discussion in a certain way. People discuss a topic. Often there are two sides to the topic, and people are bringing arguments to one side, arguments to the other side, and rebutting them. And I think that free-for-all generates a certain confusion. What I propose to do is discuss it in two halves, each one greatly simplified. There are people who believe there are no absolute values, or sometimes they put it positively, values are relative. There are people who believe that. So I want to start by asking them why they believe what they believe, what reasons they have for it, what arguments they can produce in favor of it. My role will be the role of the know-nothing moderator. I have no position at all. I don't know anything. But you know. You say you know. You're convinced. Okay? I'm interested in hearing your arguments in favor of relativism, no absolute values. Now, this kind of discussion can have two outcomes. Either the other person will succeed in producing good arguments that values are relative, and if so, then we'll know, at least provisionally, that values are relative, and it'll be finished. If his arguments don't stand up, if there are weaknesses in his arguments, if they don't carry the water, then if I can show that all his arguments don't work, what do we know? We know nothing. All we know is that we don't know they're relative. They might still be relative, might still be true. He just doesn't have any good arguments to show that they're relative. At this point, right thing to do is confess ignorance. He doesn't know that they're relative. I don't know that they're absolute. At this point, we're just equally in ignorance. Progress has been made because he thought he knew. He thought he knew. And now he has discovered that he doesn't know. That's progress, but it's all negative progress. Then switch the argument to the other side. He who believes in absolute values, let's see what he can say. Let's see what arguments that he can present for his position. If all his arguments fail, what do we conclude? Only that he's failed to prove values are absolute, and we don't know whether they are or they are not. If both sides fail, then we're really ignorant. We just don't know who's right. If the one who believes in absolute values produces arguments that do succeed, then we'll have good reason to think that he's right. But I suggest that we divide the discussion into these two halves, where one is responsible for establishing his position, and the other is just asking, did he succeed in establishing it or did he not? And then switch the focus to the other side. I think that avoids certain types of confusions. I won't bore you with going through the confusions, but this way we'll avoid them, and in that way I think the discussion will be purer than it otherwise would have been. So I propose to start with the believer in relative values, the one who says there are no absolute values. I'm going to propose some arguments people propose in favor of that position. I'm going to discuss them. Since I'm wearing the hat that I'm wearing, you probably guess what my conclusion is going to be, that they don't carry the day, they're not adequate. If I'm missing any that you're aware of, it would be wonderful to hear from you and see if we can deal with those as well. And I will conclude at the end of the first half that the relativist has not succeeded in making his position known, not succeeded in defending it. And then, depending upon the time we have, I will go on to the positive side, for which I think some things can be said. Okay, so I'm asking the relativist, the one that says there are no absolute values, why do you think that? What arguments do you have in favor of your position? First argument that's usually offered is this: different societies have different values. Different societies have different values. Values are not universal. And since they're not universal, they're relative to what each society believes in, lives by, is committed to. Some people break it down even further. Not societies, but individuals. Of course, different individuals have different values. Now, just as a footnote, I don't think the premise is true. But I'm not going to go through that. It's quite subtle and it's quite extensive. Just putting myself on record. But let's suppose it's true. Let's suppose different societies have different values. And different people have different values. So what? The fact that societies disagree about something means there's no correct view, no true view, no right view, no valid view because societies disagree about something? What's one thing got to do with the other? In the ancient world, there were disagreements about whether the earth is flat or round. Because people disagreed about whether the earth is flat or round, does that mean the earth has no shape? Because they disagreed? They disagreed about whether the earth is in motion. The idea of the earth turning on its axis is an ancient idea. Aristotle rejected it, and people followed Aristotle, but it was an ancient idea. So now, some people say it's stationary. Some people say it's rotating on its axis. So therefore, it has no state of motion because they disagree? Surely the fact that people disagree about something doesn't mean there's no truth, no right or wrong, no valid or invalid, no correct, no factual, just because they disagree. Even if we were to admit that societies or individuals disagree about their values, wouldn't follow that there are no absolute values. It has nothing to do with it. Might be so, or it might not be so. That certainly doesn't carry the day. Here's a second argument that people give. Look, people have been discussing and debating this for thousands of years. And we don't seem to be making any progress. Doesn't that mean that there's no progress to be made? Doesn't that mean that there's nothing there to be decided? Because we're just not getting anywhere with this investigation. I don't know how serious that sounds to you, but people actually talk that way. Well, I mean, the answer to that I think is pretty obvious. The fact that progress hasn't been made to date doesn't imply that progress won't be made tomorrow. Think of the projects that people were hopeless about until the modern era, and now we think we have answers. Why do the stars shine? Why do they shine? No one had a clue. One of the speculations in the ancient world that I like best is that the black night sky is velvet cloth. And the velvet cloth has holes in it, and behind that velvet cloth is a sea of light, and the stars are the light coming through the holes in the cloth. And that's imaginative, picturesque, poetic. They didn't have a clue what made stars shine. Does that mean there's nothing that makes them shine? Does that mean there's no truth of the matter? Does that mean there's no fact of the matter? Today we think it's nuclear fusion. Surely the fact that there was no progress made for thousands of years doesn't mean the issue is hopeless. It may mean that we're just in too primitive a state to deal with it. I think it's profoundly pessimistic to say, since we haven't made any progress so far, we'll never make any progress. Why should you think that? We made progress in spectacular ways that nobody anticipated. No one can say with any probability that we won't make progress in this area in the future. A third related thing that people say is that, look, there's some questions. We know what we would have to do, we just can't do it. We haven't got the technology, we haven't got the power. There's speculation about very, very heavy particles, but you'd need a collider the size of the solar system to get up enough energy to test that. So we know what needs to be done. We just don't know how to do it. It's too difficult to do. But here, in the case of values, we don't know what to do. We don't know how to conduct the investigation. We don't know what kinds of ideas will be relevant or irrelevant. We don't have a methodology that we agree on. Doesn't that show that we're simply hopelessly confused and that there's nothing real there? We can't even agree on what needs to be done. It's bad enough when you agree on what needs to be done, you just can't do it. Does the universe look the same from every point of view? Well, can you travel to every point of the universe? No. So you're never going to find out how it looks. But you know what it means because you could imagine traveling. But here we don't know what to imagine. We don't have a method that we agree on for the investigation. Surely that means there's nothing real here. Nothing true or factual or accurate here. But that's not true either. We've been in that position before, and we are in that position today with respect to some subjects. You've probably heard of alchemy. Alchemy was the attempt to turn base metals into gold and to find the elixir of life, something that would avoid death. If you imbibed it, you would be able to live forever. And they did loads of experiments, and they kept records, and there was correspondence between alchemists in different cities, checking the results of their experiments. Of course, it was terribly confused because they couldn't agree on what the important features were of the experiments. The alchemist in Berlin would write, I boiled the water, and I took the toad's tails and the whippoorwills and some old decayed eggs, and I put them in together, and what I got was sticky purple goo. And the alchemist in France would write back, gee, I tried the same thing, and it all evaporated. I didn't get any sticky goo at all. And the one in Berlin would write back, did you remember to do it on the third Thursday of the month, after midnight? Did you remember to wear the conical black hat? Did you say the incantation in Latin? Not in Greek, but in Latin? You didn't do the right experiment. That's your problem. The composition of the pot, metal or ceramic, the purity of the water, the temperature of the surroundings, the species of materials put in, that wasn't important. What was important was the conical black hat and saying the right incantation. Well, of course they didn't get the same results. They didn't know what the right variables were. That went on for centuries until gradually they began to realize that the hat doesn't matter and the incantation doesn't matter. The third Thursday of the month doesn't matter. But whether the pot is copper or ceramic matters a lot. And whether it's pure water or swamp water matters a lot. And the exact species of materials that you put in matters a lot. Chemistry was born out of alchemy. Alchemy had no agreed upon method, and therefore it gave rise to a lot of confusion. And over time, chemistry is born where the method was agreed upon, and then solid results started to appear. We're in a similar position today. There is a study, you've all heard of it, it's called psychology. What is psychology about? What kind of methods should it use? I want you to know that a well-known philosopher, I don't think much of him, but he's well-known, Daniel Dennett, wrote a book called Consciousness Explained. The reviewer for the Journal of Philosophy wrote, a better title would have been Consciousness Ignored, because in 350 pages, he didn't discuss the subject. That's a pretty big difference of opinion. One writer thinks that he's got the whole subject wrapped up and explained, and the other one thinks he hasn't addressed the subject. What do they have in common? Some people used to think, and maybe there's some who still do, that psychology is about behavior. It's about what you do. Others think it's about what's going on in your brain. Others think it's the composition of your psyche. That's where psychology comes from. And that's something that's abstract and may or may not be reflected in the brain in various ways, but that's not the interesting thing. And you get at it by talking to people and getting responses and analyzing their dreams. And the three can't agree on appropriate method. They can't agree on what's relevant. Subjective reports, I felt this way. Are they relevant or they're not relevant? The three of them have three different views. Psychology is a mess. Does that mean there are no facts, no reality, no truth, no validity, no correctness? Surely not. It just means we're very confused. There's no reason to predict that psychology could never become a science. As someone put it about ethics, they haven't had their Newton yet. Newton organized a whole field, created a methodology that produced solid results, and ever since Newton, everything that's been going on is the inheritance of Newton, even though his theories were wrong. But all physics in school starts with Newton. You learn what he wrote, you learn why he did it and how he did it, And then you learn the problems and the later developments. Because he put the whole discipline on a solid foundation. Psychology hasn't had its Newton yet. Maybe ethics hasn't had its Newton yet either. The fact that we don't agree on a methodology doesn't mean a case is hopeless. It just means that we're hopeless. But maybe tomorrow's people will be smarter and deeper, and they'll get something out of it. These are the arguments in favor of relative values or no absolute values. They don't carry the day. They do not give good reason to think that there are no absolute values. So at this point, I conclude there are no good arguments for relativism. Therefore, as I said at the introduction, therefore we don't know anything. Therefore, we have no reason to accept relativism. It might still be true. It might still be true. There just aren't good arguments in favor of it. Certainly doesn't establish absolute values. That's a separate subject, a separate discussion. And that we'll pass to in a moment. Questions up to here. If I've missed any arguments that you know of in favor of relative values, I'll be glad to hear them and try to deal with them. Or if you have questions about the arguments that I presented and rebutted, I'll be happy to do that. Otherwise, we can move to absolute values. We together so far? Okay, now, what can be said in favor of absolute values? Why it's reasonable to believe. That's not a proof that it's true, but why it's reasonable to believe. First of all, anything, any idea, any proposition that's obviously true to everybody is appropriate to believe unless and until somebody comes up with a good objection. When you're starting in an investigation, when you're starting to look at the world, when you're starting to question things, anything that's obviously true to everybody is a default position that you should start from. Other developments may lead you to give it up, but in the meantime, it's appropriate to take it as true unless and until it's challenged. Now, some people are disturbed by this and they say, what do you mean? What's your reason for it? What's your proof of it? I should accept it as true without a proof? Isn't that just dogmatism? Shouldn't we demand a proof, or at least a good reason for believing something before we believe it? I don't think so. And I'm a philosopher. My field especially was logic. I don't think so. Because look, if you're going to demand a proof or a good reason for believing everything, you're off on an infinite chase. Why do you believe A? Because B. Why do you believe B? Because C. I'm not tired yet. Why do you believe C? Because D. Well, why do you believe D? Because E. Now, how is this going to go on? Get to Z. Why do you believe Z? Because of double A. Double A because double B. Double B because double C. Everything has to have a good reason? Everything has to have a proof? Well, then, you'll never get anything because you're always going to be looking for the next step, and then you'll never run out of steps. You'll always have to have another step. And by the way, since your brain is finite, you can't have an infinity of steps in there. Sooner or later, you've got to stop. It can't be that we demand for everything that you believe another reason why it's appropriate. Because otherwise, you're off on an infinite chase. That's one problem. And it's another problem as well. I say, why do you believe A? It's because B. B can't just be any old thing. B has to be something which, first of all, supports A, and second of all, is at least or perhaps better, more solid, more reliable than A. If B isn't any more reliable than A, you didn't make any progress. Why do you believe what Peter said? Because Paul said so. Okay. Why do you believe what Paul said? Because he said it. Does Paul then support Peter? I have no reason to believe Peter, so then he doesn't give any support to Paul. So when I ask for a reason, I want something that's better off, more solid, more convincing. I'm using vague words because the subject is vague. More convincing, more appropriate, more valid. I want a reason for A, I want something that's better than A. Good. Let's say I find one, B. But now if I want a reason for B, I better get something that's better than B. Let's say that's C. How far can you go up the better ladder, the better chain? Is there just an infinite hierarchy of how good things can get? Isn't there a cutoff point where the thing is so obvious, so clear, so compelling that there isn't anything better than that? Suppose you came up to 2 plus 2 is 4. Somebody said, yeah, but why is 2 plus 2 4? What's your reason for that? What could you appeal to that you know better than 2 plus 2 is 4? What's stronger than that? What's more certain than that? What's more valid than 2 plus 2 is 4? I think we've reached the top of the chain. There isn't anything that we know of that's more certain than 2 plus 2 is 4. What, 2 plus 1 is 3? 1 plus 1 is 2? Okay. There isn't anything beyond that. So to demand another reason or another proof for everything you believe is a double mistake. It's a mistake because if you do that, you have to go on to infinity, which is nuts. And second of all, because since every reason's got to be better than the thing it's a reason for, there's a limit to how high you can go. You get to the things that are just obvious to everybody, and that's the stopping point for reasons. So if you want to be reasonable, you have to realize that reasons stop somewhere. And where they stop is where it's appropriate to accept a proposition without further reasons, without further proof. Again, I said it 3 times, I'm saying it a 4th time. Again, that doesn't mean it's necessarily right. If you like, I'll show you how that could be a mistake afterwards. But it's certainly appropriate to stop there and say, you can't demand any more from me because there's no more to be had. At that point, it's perfectly reasonable to stop and say, that's where I'm standing. You think it's wrong? Give me a reason to think that it's wrong. If you can't give me a reason to think that it's wrong, I'm perfectly justified in sitting where I am. That's true for 2 plus 2 is 4. I'll give you another example. How about the proposition that there are tables? There are tables. I think that's absolutely certain. Everyone, at least everyone who lives in a society where there are tables, knows that from unending personal experience. There's no way you could take the suggestion that might be wrong seriously. What probability would you give on there being tables? 100%, thank you. I'm not going to start short of 100%. There's no doubt. I can't imagine how that could be doubted. So that's an appropriate starting place. Anything that everybody is convinced is correct is an appropriate starting place unless and until somebody has a way to undermine it. Okay, I suggest to you that everyone is convinced that there are absolute values. I'm not talking now about what they write in their philosophy papers. I'm talking about what they're convinced of, how they live, how they look at the world. There's no one, I think, who can sincerely say that what the Nazis did was just their culture. And we have a different culture, so we look at it differently. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with their conception, with their philosophy, with their approach. It was just different from ours. Maybe we don't like it, but there's nothing really wrong with it. I don't think anybody can seriously say that. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal 100 years ago. I didn't read it when it came out. I just read it later. Okay, it wasn't 100 years ago. A student writes a paper in philosophy about the relativity of values. And his professor gives him an F. So he comes the student is supporting relative values. So he comes into the professor and he says, why did you give me an F? Look at my arguments. I presented a good paper. And the professor said, because you're dead wrong. And he said, what do you mean I'm dead wrong? And besides, even if you think I'm wrong, that's not a reason to give me an F. You can't do that. The professor says, what? I can't do that? Sure I can. Watch. F next to your name. He said, but that's not right. That's not right to do that. That's not just to do that. Okay, now, who's talking? Who's talking? The student who wrote a paper defending relative values. What do you mean that's not right? What do you mean that's not just? Who's talking? The professor says, those are your values. I have different values. You're going to contend me with your values? Who cares about your values? Values are relative. Will the student at this point say, oh, I must be confused. I forgot that. Right. It's perfectly okay. Nothing wrong with you writing an F on my paper. I have my values. You have your values. You're following your values. Is that what he's going to do? I doubt it very much. I think he's going to go to the president of the university and get him fired. That's what I think. Because when push comes to shove, we are all convinced that there are absolute values. We may be embarrassed to say so in some certain public, but we're all convinced that there are absolute values. By the way, here's a very interesting pair of views that many people accept. One view is there are no absolute values, and the other is universal human rights. Now let's stop and think. No absolute values, and yet universal human rights. How do they go together? There was a fellow named Suharto who was the leader of Indonesia, the dictator of Indonesia. And when the United Nations was preaching about universal human rights, he said, rights is a Western invention. We live in the East. Don't export your culture to us. Don't export your culture to us. We don't need it. So then, what's the idea of universal human rights? They don't really go together. If you really are a relativist, then another country, another culture that practices violation of what you think of as human rights is perfectly okay. It's perfectly okay. I don't think people believe that. They may be worried about the variety of their philosophical commitments, but when the push comes to shove and somebody's clearly victimized, at that point, they're not going to stand for it. So I think that everybody agrees that there are universal human rights, which means unless and until somebody can undermine that in a convincing way, that's the position we ought to take. Now, let's push the idea a little bit further. There are disagreements in the world. People have different views on various subjects. There was a great debate about Pluto. Should Pluto be the ninth planet, or should it be demoted to a dwarf planet, which means it isn't a planet? And that was the decision taken by the majority. There's still a minority that thinks it was a mistake. It's controversial whether Pluto's a real planet or only a dwarf planet. There's conflict between quantum mechanics and relativity, and physicists are divided. Which way should we go? Modify relativity or modify quantum mechanics? It's a dispute, disagreement, and at this moment, there's no way to settle a disagreement. No one has a solution to the problems of the conflict. And they disagree about it. Is disagreement open for everything? Can we credit disagreement about any subject whatsoever? Suppose someone said, I heard you a moment ago about tables. I understand how you feel. I know your hypothesis is that there are tables. That's your theory. But I disagree. I say there are no tables. You say there are tables. I say there are no tables. It's a free world, and that's my position. I just think there are no tables. I don't think we're going to accept that. If somebody said with a straight face that there are no tables, what are our options? He's joking, and he's good at keeping a straight face. Or he's drunk or on drugs. Or he's just lying for the sake of conversation or entertainment. Or he's nuts. Because the evidence of tables is all around you. It isn't a hypothesis. It isn't a theory. It's a matter of universal common experience. It isn't as if I've chosen this option, but I should understand and respect someone who's chosen another option. There isn't another option to choose, opt for, as options are. Opt for. The evidence all around you doesn't allow for opting for the opposite, like it might for Pluto being a dwarf planet, or like it might for the conflict between quantum mechanics and relativity. Here, the evidence is overwhelming. So a person who simply says, I choose to disagree, has disqualified himself from serious discussion. There's a difference between items over which there can be serious disagreement and items over which there cannot. Now, let me fill in something that I said 3 times already, and let me fill it in now at this point, and then I'll go on to the conclusion that I want to reach. If he says, you have your thought and I have my thought, then he's disqualified himself from serious consideration. But he might have another story to tell, and I might have to take it seriously. That's why I said before that something that everybody's convinced is obviously true might still be wrong. Suppose he says this: I want you to know that I was hiking in the Andes Mountains, and on a mountaintop I came across a crashed spaceship. Crashed spaceship. And in it, I found that these aliens were coming to take over the world. And because they were doing that, they had picked up signals of English, and they decided to communicate among one another in English. And I found their writings, I found their tables. And one of the things I found was a plan to take over world communications and to hypnotize everyone in the world and give them a post-hypnotic suggestion to believe in tables. And in the diary of their activities, you have the date and the time and all the channels that were taken over and how long they had it and so forth and so on. And then the report for the success. We've tested all over the world, and people now believe in tables, and we succeeded in planting this post-hypnotic suggestion. Now he tells me this story, and I think, wait a minute. You know, if that's right, he could explain why we all believe in tables, and they don't have to be tables. Now, that's challenging. If that were true, then my belief in table would be undermined. Yes, I lean on them and buy them and chop them for firewood and make new ones and paint them, but all that could be just the result of hypnosis. Could be not real. If he tells me a story like that, then I might have to take it seriously. That's not just opting for the alternative. That's just opting for the alternative. You believe there are tables, I believe there are no tables. That's not an option. A person who says that is simply not, you can't take him seriously in a discussion. He has one of the 4 disabilities that I mentioned before. But if he has a whole story to tell, a story about how we got to where we are and why it need not be true, then we might have to take it seriously. Now, I suggest to you that 2 + 2 is 4 is one of those items about which a simple opting to disagree is not acceptable. There are no tables, or there are tables, is an item about which simply opting to disagree is not available. And here's another one. Torturing small children for fun is wrong. Torturing small children for fun is wrong. I think that's another item about which an optional disagreement is not available. Person who said, I know how you feel. I know how you feel. You think that torturing small children for fun is wrong? But let me tell you, that's your feeling. That's your hypothesis. That's your theory. But I have a different theory. I disagree. I think torturing small children for fun is perfectly okay. No moral complaint against it. At that point, I think he's not a party for serious discussion unless, and here's an option I didn't mention before, I mentioned 4 before, unless maybe he means something for them from what we mean. And that's what we do in common discourse. When somebody says to you something that to you is nuts, is obviously wrong, the first thing you ask him is, what do you mean? Because you say, I think you're serious, I think you're competent, you're not on drugs, you're not joking, so then you can't hold what your words say, or what I understand your words, you can't hold that, because it's obviously wrong, so you must mean something else. This in linguistics is called the principle of charity. The other guy is competent and intelligent and understands, then he must mean something else by his words. But one thing you can't do is say, oh sure, we have a disagreement. I think torturing small children for fun is wrong, and he thinks it's okay. It's just a disagreement. You can't say that because he's contradicting something that is obvious to everyone. To contradict something that's obvious to everyone, you have to have a whole story to tell of how people got to the position that they did, what they think the basis of it is, and why, according to your story, it's really not correct. But without that, opting to disagree is simply not serious. In philosophy, there's a distinction between a philosophical doubt and a serious doubt. That's a nasty distinction, because it means that philosophical doubts aren't really serious, and many of them aren't really serious. Many of them are just for play. Many of them sin against what I said at the very beginning. The relativist will say, you think they're absolute? Prove it. You can't prove it, so you're wrong. They're relative. That's a mistake. We talked about that. The absolutist can't prove it. All you know is he can't prove it. That's all. You don't know he's wrong. You just know he can't prove it. Okay, so now let's take those items about which, since they are so obviously correct to everyone, a serious disagreement can't be accepted. Like it's wrong to torture small children for fun. In the meantime, they're absolute. And if somebody says, but you have no proof for it, I say, sure, there are lots of things for which you don't have any proofs. I gave 2 reasons for that already. I admit that I don't have a proof, and it's still appropriate to take it as correct and absolute. That's one type of argument in favor of absolutism. I want to give you a second one, and then we can discuss it at the end of the hour. I once was talking about truth, and I mentioned some proposition, either it was from the Upanishads or the I Ching, 2 scriptures of the Far East, and I said it was false. And one of the students said, you mean Western false. You mean Western false. But those are Eastern works. What difference does it make if Eastern works are Western false? Maybe they're Eastern true. So I said to him, listen, I don't think that's correct. Reflect. True is my word. It's my word. It belongs to my culture. It belongs to my language. The word and the concept behind it belong to me. Now, you want to talk about how to apply my word to a different culture? Fine, we could talk about that. But to suggest that another culture has a very different concept and it deserves the title TRUE is just a mistake, because TRUE is the name for my concept. If the other concept is really radically different, so that the same proposition in the Upanishads can be Western true and Eastern Western false and Eastern true, then it isn't TRUE. Don't use my word. Call it blah and say whatever you want about it. But don't use my word. Let's suppose in China that they play a game in riverbeds with water flowing, on horseback, with big poles, and the point of the game is to push as many rocks as you can up onto the other guy's side of the river. Okay? And when you ask them, what's the name of this game? They call it chess. This is Chinese chess. We know you have a game called chess. This is our version. Chinese chess. I mean, that's not even a joke. That's not chess. It's not like chess. That's similar to chess. Call it something else. Call it parcheesi. No, parcheesi is another game. It doesn't not play on riverbeds, not play with poles, pushing stones from one side to the other. Give it your own name. Calling it chess is just ridiculous. It doesn't agree with our concept at all. If they had a game of chess which didn't allow castling, well, in China this is how we play chess. That could be accepted. Oh, castling, one move, one type of move. It makes a substantial difference, but still, you could imagine that. Baseball, they raised the pitcher's mound to give him more advantage. It was still baseball. Designated hitters were introduced. It was still baseball. But something that's too far out doesn't deserve the title TRUE. The idea that different cultures have different concepts of truth, and the different concepts of truth are really quite substantially different from one another, and it's just dogmatism to say that yours is better than theirs, is a mistake. It's not just dogmatism. It's our concept in our language. We apply our concept to the world. It applies to concepts that are relevantly similar. If it's really different, then it isn't TRUE. Not another form of TRUE. Doesn't deserve the title TRUE. Now, let's think about other cultures having really different values. Maybe X is just in your culture, but in their culture, X is unjust. Well, let's see. How far is it going to go? Maybe in your culture, it's unjust to torture small children for fun, but in their culture, it is just to torture small children for fun. At that point, I'm going to draw a line and say, you can't use JUST for that. It's too far out. Doesn't agree with my concept at all. Isn't related to my concept. As if someone said, in that culture, what is just is to do everything the king says no matter what. That's not their concept of justice. It's not justice. It's like Chinese chess played in a riverbed. Doesn't deserve the title JUST. There are certain disagreements. The concepts are not perfectly clear. They're not perfectly clear on two sides of the Charles River in Cambridge, Massachusetts, between Harvard and MIT. They're definitely difficult questions, but there are also definite limits, beyond which, if you press that far, you're not talking about these concepts at all. And that means that, at least when you push against the limits of the concept, you're pushing up against the limits of where absolute values stop. That is to say, where they apply. And if you go beyond that, it will be an absolute mistake to say that it's value. It's not value at all. And those, I think, are two good reasons for saying that what we are all convinced of as obviously true, it is appropriate to accept as true, even though it might not be true, but it's appropriate to accept, fully rational to accept as true. And also, where you push the limits of the concepts, you can't coherently say that there's a mistake being made. Those are two good arguments, I think, for absolute values.